Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Today, we will be hosting a webinar on reporting climate migration stories and evidence and ethics. We have an excellent lineup. Nevertheless, it's Nihal Ranjit from IIHS and Sophia Juliet Rajan, also from IIHS. I will dive into their bios in a brief while, but just taking another moment to just say good morning from the Climate Change Media Hub of the Asian College of Journalism. This is supported by the Interlink Academy in Germany. Today's online session explores the topic of reporting climate migration, stories, evidence, and ethics. We are delighted to have Nihal Ranjit, Sophia Juliet Rajan from IIHS, who will share their insights and perspectives. Nihal Ranjit has over 5 years of experience as a researcher at the interface of disaster risk reduction and climate change adaptation. His research expertise spans understanding experiences of long-term disaster recovery, assessing differential vulnerabilities to climate change, and barriers and enablers to climate change adaptation and migration, with a focus on coastal states of India. Currently, he's studying the experiences and outcomes of climate-related planned relocations in coastal Odisha. Thank you, Nihal, for joining us. Sophia Juliet Rajan is an editor and researcher at the IIHS. IIHS is Indian Institute for Human Settlements. She's part of the Word Lab. She focuses on bridging research and public discourse through writing, editorial strategy, publication development. She is a former journalist and collaborates on diverse publications, leading workshops and editorial training. As a part of the Climate Change Local Adaptations Pathways, called CLAPS project at IIHS, she has led the co-creation of a project called Shifting Grounds. It's a guide for ethical and evidence-based climate migration storytelling. Thank you, Sophia, for joining us today. So today's session will be around 45 minutes, followed by a 15-minute question and answer thing for the audience. Audiences can leave their questions in the chat as well, and we can perhaps take it up in the flow of the event. So, Sophia and Nihal are from IIHS, and they have been working on the CLAPS project, which is the Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways Project. And today we will be talking about the evidence, ethics, and stories around climate migration in India. And I was just beginning to talk about how from beyond anecdotal evidence from reporters and studies, now we have more and more granular data from India. Studies across 640 districts show that every 1% increase in temperature above optimal, agricultural level will lead to a drop in agriculture by 8.7% and increasing rural urban migration as a result. Between 2005 and 2024, approximately 24 million people in India were driven to move. And experts across the country say that, yes, migration has always happened in the country, but now it is worsened because of climate vulnerability. And I'm hoping Nihal and Sophia can shed more light on how this shapes the journalism that we do today. So with this, I will hand it over to Sophia to talk about set the context for the CLAPS project and what it does.
Thank you, Mahima. And I hope everybody can hear me. Good afternoon, and thank you for being here with us today. I want to use this session to stay with the question of climate migration, but slightly from a different angle. A lot of discourse on this topic usually starts with numbers and projections and or extreme climatic events. While these are very, very important, but for most people, for the common audience, climate migration becomes real only when it enters public discourse through stories and headlines and photographs and other repeated media frames. At the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, the Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways projects. So at IIHS, through the Climate Change Local Adaptation Pathways project, we've been looking at how climate change is shaping mobility patterns. That includes who are moving, who is staying back, and how adaptation plays out in India. And one part of that work is to ask how climate-induced migration is being narrated in the media. So one of the first things that this work made clear to us is that climate-induced migration does not arrive in media as one stable thing. It appears in different forms depending on what kind of story is being told. So the same movement, the same mobility pattern can be framed as displacement, as adaptation, as labor migration, or even as pressure on the destination cities that migrants are moving to. A very familiar example is coastal Odisha, where some of our colleagues are working extensively. So after cyclones or flooding, most coverage tends to foreground losses and displacement, which is very normal in any disaster coverage. But if one looks at migration from the same state, Odisha, through a labor story, maybe from another place in Surat or Kochi or Bangalore, the framing then shifts. So the same mobility, it is not necessarily a climate-linked displacement anymore, but as a employment or job-seeking movement. So the event frame, or the climate event frame, and the labor frame then produces completely different meanings, even when they refer to overlapping realities. So then CLAP's fieldwork in Odisha and also Kerala then captures exactly this sort of an entanglement where climate shocks, livelihood shifts, and labor mobility, they're all interconnected and sit together. So this is why we feel that it helps to treat journalism here not only as describing what is happening, but also as an interpretation. So the story is already pulling together or organizing these experiences and deciding whether the central character is a victim or a worker or a household strategist or a burden on the city, which is the destination cities. And once we begin to see that, once we begin to see that, then it becomes easier to ask what might be missing from the coverage of these stories, which is what I will move to next. Next slide, please. So as I was saying, the CLAPS project looks at migration, staying, and livelihood adaptation as different adaptation pathways shaped by unequal opportunities, risks, and other challenges. So this matters because media coverage often then defaults to one of these two extremes. So either migration is read and reported as a breakdown.
Yeah, sorry.
All right. So as I was saying, then the media tends to then categorize or classify climate-linked migration into two extremes by either reporting migration as a breakdown, or it is romanticized as resilience. And in this project, in the CLAPS project, so what we're trying to do is complicate these two extremes. And in Bengaluru, which is also one of the sites that we are studying, the project has documented how migrants in informal settlements are exposed to waterlogging, repeated flooding, heat stress, precarious housing, and insecure employment. So this migration does not automatically solve vulnerability. It just shifts the location of that same vulnerability from the source to the destination. So at the same time, CLAP's work in Odisha and rural Karnataka has also shown that moving is not necessarily passivity. So staying in the source, the decision to stay can also involve active forms of household management, agricultural shifts, and risk and navigating risk, because somebody has to then take over the jobs that the migrants have left in the source cities. So then what this shows is the larger landscape where moving, staying, and adapting are all part of how people respond to climate change, how communities respond to climate change. So as we already know, India has very large migration flows, and climate change is not a new phenomenon in migration. So this migration is then interacting with existing mobility systems, labor markets, and agricultural and agrarian stress, and also rapid urbanization. And as reports are saying, India has around 450 million internal migrants, and by 2035, as the slide says, 43% of the population is expected to live in cities. So in this context, and then think of long-standing rural to urban migration from drought-prone areas of Karnataka or Maharashtra and other rural areas. And so this mobility is not new. This migration has been happening for centuries. But what is changing is the frequency of this movement, which is influenced by crop stress, heat pressure, and the unpredictable and changing patterns of rainfall, and the fragility of livelihoods itself. So the story is, climate. It's not climate created migration from scratch, and it is just reshaping older mobility patterns that have already existed, and this is now happening in more unequal and stressful ways. And this is where the gap between what we know from research and what we see in the media becomes quite visible. I will pause here and check if Mahima has anything to add.
So, Sophia, I got what you kind of were trying to say, that there is a lot of migration that India has already seen, but increasingly this is going to shift. And we are talking about 43%, as you said, of India will live in cities. What are the gaps that the CLAPS project has found? What is the research questions or journalists also need to ask going forward? Because now we are talking about a huge section of the population which is going to live very differently. So what should we be looking at? Is this something maybe Nihal you can shed light on?
Thanks, Mahima. Thanks, Sophie, for setting that up. So, like Sophie was saying, CLAPS has, when we're looking at climate change and mobility much more broadly and looking at different aspects of it, and what we have taken is like a whole corridor approach. So, not just looking at mobility from either the source or the destination, but seeing what happens in both places, kind of doing these long life history tracer studies, actually documenting some of those journeys and so on. So I think broadly, that's what, in terms of the work, that's probably one of the innovations, both in terms of research questions and methods, that this project has, where we are not just focusing on either of the source and destination, but also seeing how they are interrelated to each other. And I think broadly, if you look at migration research as a whole, and specifically in the context of climate change, that is something that has been absent. What has also been absent is even studies on climate change and mobility has also largely focused on migration. But what we often miss out is the fact that a lot of people, a lot of populations in these very high mobile zones, they don't migrate. There is also a lot of immobility when you talk about climate migration. So that is also something that this particular work tries to understand, and also tries to, that's, so when we talk about narrative change, it's not just in terms of how migration and migrants are viewed in destination, but also how this whole idea and how the whole research around climate change migration can itself be reformulated. So what I can talk to the group here today is about one particular aspect in this whole project, which largely focused on narrative change. And like Sophie had started off earlier, we did pick media as one of those mediums that is a very influential player in this particular space about forming narratives among other actors. So in that regard, we wanted to study how this whole idea of climate change migration and climate change and migration is being represented in media. And from some of our research work and literature review, what we've understood is that much of the research on this has largely been focused in either in the Western context, in the global North context, which talks about people from global South moving into global South, and how global North, and how do media houses there represent or talk about migrants, or mostly from the islands, from the Pacific Islands and small island developing nations, which also often has a very fatalistic sort of a framing. And very few studies have been contextualized in India. So that's how we actually got into studying. So let's see what the Indian media is talking about climate change, at the intersection of climate change and migration. And that was broadly our uh, research questions for this work. And so if we can go to the next slide, please. And I can quickly walk everybody through what we did during this study. So to understand what is the narrative out there, we first had to see how it is being spoken about in the media. And so this particular study is restricted to English media in India. And we did like a keyword search on different platforms along with about the keywords that you see on the screen about climate change, disasters, migration, migrants, and so on. And we did this study sometime in 2024, and which is why we have an intervening period of 2000 to 2023, which we looked at this study. And broadly, in terms of the period, we do see that post 2015, which is when the Paris Agreement came into place, you don't really see a lot of media reports, let alone on climate change and migration. You don't see a lot of media reports on the topic climate change as is pre 2014, 2015, around that period. So after this keyword search, what we really focused on was looking at articles, news reports that really spoke about both migration and climate change, and not either or. So that was one of our inclusion exclusion criteria. And we did leave out very small articles, like those that were of like less than 250 words, which if they were like very short bulletin, and also all of those were left out. Location, we really wanted it to be India specific, and broadly looking at all forms of mobility. But what we didn't really focus on is any reference to nomadism, pastoralism, and so on, because that also has a whole different history of movement, which is quite distinct from the kind of mobility that we are dealing with here. So based on all of that and all of these inclusion exclusion criteria, we had around 76 articles to work with across different media houses in the country. Sophie, next slide, please. Yeah, so each of the articles that we looked at these things. We looked at how is the article talking about who's migrating, broadly trying to qualitatively understand how is climate change and migration being depicted in these news reports, and what forms of evidences that they are using to make the argument, and is there any conversation around the outcomes of such migrations. In addition to some of the media review that we did, we also spoke to journalists, senior journalists, and editors from a whole bunch of newsrooms in the country, because we, like Sophie and others who were in the team, were also like seasoned journalists, so they also understand the news cycle and also how certain news really comes to the forefront. So to understand what the narratives, what are the pressures in the newsroom, we really had to speak to some of these people to get a much more holistic picture of the realities of reporting. Next slide, Sophie. I don't think I should go into each and every slide of our findings. So there is a report that we have towards CNN, which I think will be shared. So and it's open access, so you can look at it. But very broadly, if and a quick run through some of our headline findings is that a lot of articles that we spoke to did not really specify who are the people who are migrating. So often there was a very homogeneous framing of migrants. So, and like from our research that we already do, we know that it's much more nuanced that and that has also implications on why people are moving and also the kind of outcomes. So a single male migrant moving versus a family moving versus a single woman moving, all of these have very different experiences and outcomes of migration, which a lot of news articles that we were reviewing tend to really homogenize. And what was also really missing was the stories of women migrants. And from the work that we do in this Odisha Kerala corridor that we are currently focusing on, what we see is there is a substantially large chunk of single women migrants that move between these places, and which I mean, owing to a host of factors, even with respect to being able to access some of these workers, did not really feature in much of the articles that we had looked at. Next slide. Again, this so some of the other factors that we looked at to understand who the articles are speaking about is to understand where the people that media houses report as migrating, where are they coming from, and the patterns kind of neatly overlap with what we know about the climate realities of our country. Often, the eastern part of our country, like states like Odisha, West Bengal, Assam, are climate vulnerable hotspots, and they often feature in most of research and also media as extremely states that are extremely prone to climate change impacts. And that's exactly what we also saw in much of our sample, where there's a lot of mention of movement between from these states. And what this tell us is also the fact that some of these states are known for like very rapid onset events like cyclones and floods, and like particularly states like Assam and on annual recurring floods. And what maybe this kind of focus or hyper focus on some of these states, what that masks is also the impacts of like much more slow onset events, like whether it be heat or droughts and so on. And that is also kind of reflected in, because these sort of slow onset hazards also result in people moving, and a lot of that does not get adequately captured in some of our stories. Next slide, please. So on the reasons for migration, because again, this is a virtue of how we built our sample, because we were particularly and purposively looking for stories at the intersection of climate change and migration. So broadly, those were obviously the two themes that do come up, but it just varies in terms of how and what's the extent of how each of these factors are focused. So for a lot of states, for a lot of stories, climate change is like understood or portrayed as being as the primary driver of movement. A lot of other stories tend to nuance this a little further, portraying climate change as one among the drivers, and they do recognize the fact that there are multiple layers of vulnerability, and climate change is actually exacerbating some of these movements. Next slide, Sophie. Yeah, so this was another exercise we tried to understand what were the different words that have been used in the pieces in the news reports to describe people who are moving. And because these are not like, I mean, there is a difference in these terminologies when you use the word migrant versus a worker versus a refugee. They all mean different things, and they all have a loaded understanding to it. Again, broadly, this is how these were the kind of words that we saw. We saw words of climate migrants, refugees, uh, people being called as victims, say in the case of stories related to how climate change and trafficking, for instance, interact. When they were speaking about certain kinds of specific sectors, they use the word bonded labor migrants and so on. And sometimes very specific to certain the kind of hazards they were talking about. There were cases where news reports use the word drought migrants to refer to people who have moved where drought was an immediate trigger. Energy migrants, like one of the stories talked about declining jobs in coal mining and so on, and how a shift in terms of fuel is also resulting in loss of work and so on. So yeah, broadly, these were the kind of labels that we see used depending on the drivers of movement and also how much agency they had over the decision to migrate. Next slide. Again, and this the how the nature of movement was discussed goes back to the first point about how migration in itself was spoken about and how migrants were spoken about. Largely, we see that a majority of the articles did speak about this form of migration in a very homogeneous fashion. And like I was saying, only a handful of articles did speak about cases of people who are immobile and also experience of people who are staying behind and also factors that are constraining their mobility.
Nihal,
Yeah.
here could you take a minute to just tell us about the people who are immobile and stay behind, and how how their stories also matter when we talk about migration? If you have any insights on that, could you please share that?
Sure. So particularly in the context of these very high mobile zones, most often the trope that we see both in research and also in some sort of in media houses is that the fact that a lot of people are uh, not moving owing to main broadly due to two factors. Either they voluntarily choose to stay back owing to deep sense and sentiments towards the place, or because they don't have the means to migrate. And this is quite nuanced when you actually think about how do you then build climate action, or how do you think of climate intervention at these places, at the source regions in this particular context. For instance, how do you plan for adaptation interventions in communities, in village populations where a large chunk of your working age population is outside? It's outside. So this is how there are direct implications on how you devise climate actions for places, which is why it is necessary also to be able to include uh, voices of people who are immobile, because otherwise it kind of paints a picture that everybody in a particular village is moving, but in reality that's not the case, and there are a host of vulnerabilities associated to it. It could be in terms of the demography of people who are staying behind. If it predominantly tends to be elderly and young children, for instance, and the kind of support that the state and the local level administration has to cater for some of these places are entirely different from what you would devise for communities that have like a fairly equal distribution of the population in terms of age group, livelihoods, and so on. And it also, like, from a narrative point of view, I think it 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 paints migration not as something that people do out of desperation. It, by also focusing on the fact that people are staying behind, it kind of paints migration as a choice that one is taking. And B, it also in some senses allays this alarmist framing that you have, and I think some of my later slides talk about this, because often words that are used are swarms of migrants, exodus of migrants. So it kind of allays that sort of a very alarmist or sensationalist idea of movement also, when you do focus on people moving behind us, people who are staying behind as well. I hope that answers your question, Mike.
Yes, thank you.
And I think that kind of builds on to what this particular slide kind of builds on to what I was just talking about. That it by much of our stories, because they do focus on these rapid onset events and so the kind of movement that is triggered as a result of some of these events. Broadly, how climate change and migration is framed, it becomes framed as a story of crisis. It is not often portrayed as a story where people are actually taking as not like decisions people are taking, because it a lot of factors lead to people migrating, and it's just maybe a particular cyclone or a flood was a trigger, but then it is not just a quick decision on the go that people make. It often involves the person who is migrating, their family, and a whole bunch of other factors. So it's often a calculated move. And when we largely focus on a particular event and then and that being the immediate trigger, it often gets portrayed as something that is as a story of crisis. So, and a lot of our news reports have focused on people leaving, but not so much on how that moving really helps the people who are staying behind, how it helps them to adapt, and so on. And the direct implication of this is, if stories are pitched in certain ways, the way the policy also kind of responds to it becomes for this. So the immediate reaction in terms of policy would be to focus on like relief, and also like to ways to control out migration, rather than uh, enabling or supporting migration as like a livelihood strategy in itself, which is what the reality is. It's like calculations that households make as a way of diversifying their livelihoods. Next slides. And that builds onto this particular point about because the focus is on people leaving, a lot of reporting on climate migration also has a clear rural bias in it, where a lot of stories are from the source regions emphasizing uh, loss of agriculture, livelihoods, decline of all of these are very important things, stories to tell, but very few articles do go into the second half of the story as to what happens to people once they migrate, and how is climate change also intersecting with their vulnerabilities in the destinations places in the destination sites. Because as we know, none of our cities, like most cities that they migrants come for work, the big cities of say either Bangalore, Chennai, Delhi, and so on, they are also not free from any of these climate hazards that we speak about. So, and often the migrant communities are the ones who are at most risk in some of these places too. So the crucial second half of the story is what is missing in most of the reportage on climate migration. Yeah, I think we can skip this because I did go into this when we were talking a little earlier. Yeah, and this also, like in terms of who is being what are the evidence source that is being used for to make some of to build some of these stories. A lot of what we see is a lot of articles are relying on published research and reports and so on, and there is also a lot of quotations and interviews with, and I think that's how like journalists also often go about constructing stories, looking at multiple resources, looking at research reports, consulting policy experts, consulting researchers, and so on. uh, but broadly what we are seeing is also like life experiences of people. Often they're used for like certain human interest stories, but their experience of migration, moving, kind of gets diffused in uh, some of these stories. So there is some sort of an imbalance that comes there, where there is where one privileges so-called scientific reports at the cost of lived experiences and voices of people who actually go through some of these changes. Yeah, I will stop here and hand over to my.
Hi, yes, thank you. Thank you, Niyal, for that excellent overview in laying what we as journalists have been doing so far, or the media has been doing so far in the and what is uh, the lack of information or research, and how we are kind of, you know, falling into the trap of calling migrants victims and refugees, and negative framing in general, instead of stories of resilience, of choices, of livelihoods, and something that is very thoughtfully done, instead of reactively, a reactive response to crises, climate crises. So Sophia, I just wanted to turn to you and ask, what should we do now, like, as journalists? Most of us in the audience today are journalists. How do we frame these stories better? How do we tell this story more, in a more wholesome way?
Thanks, Mahima and Nihal. Um, I I would like to quickly show a reporting guide. Is it visible? I mean, it is blurred for me. So this is called Shifting Grounds, telling the climate migration story in India. And this was an outcome of this extensive media analysis and review that Nihal did, and the key informant interviews that we did with some of the senior journalists and reporters across India to understand where climate linked migration reporting stands. So while the media and like the news coverage analysis showed us these gaps and evidences, we also wanted to understand the reality of newsrooms, as we know that the landscape of journalism has changed so much and continues to change, and there are more challenges than ever now. The shortage of funds, there are limited resources, and news priorities have shifted. The way audience consumes news has shifted. Like print is almost on the verge of extinction, and there's so many issues. So coverage and reporters, journalists, and editors are also trying to do their best given these challenges. And so when we spoke to some of these journalists is when we understood there are real constraints in terms of travel. For example, if they have to travel to a remote area of the country, or to one of these source sites and spend some time there, they don't have that kind of manpower or resources or the funding to support that form of long form journalism, where a journalist can stay in one place over a period of time and do some quality reporting. And districts, when we talk about districts, we all know that the number of reporters in districts have reduced so much, at least in the last decade or more. And there are, as we know, 2 or 3 reporters managing multiple districts. And that's a lot of pressure on journalists also to then bring out full and grounded and rounded stories. So given all these limitations, we also realized that some of these grassroots reporters and those outside of cities and urban places do not always have the access to resources or even experts to talk to understand how climate and migration intersect and how to tell these stories. And this work then exactly tries to address some of it, where we break down some common terms in terms of differences between what is climate change, what is climate variability, what is a remittance, and what is the difference between climate and weather. And at some point, we should be able to translate this in other languages, so that it reaches more journalists, at least journalists covering and reporting in native languages of India. Sorry, I didn't move my slide. So, like I said, reporting climate-induced migration is reporting because, as I said, we don't always tend to link these together. We've been reporting about migration for a long time. Like sometimes it is a human development story, it is a labor story, or it is any other issue, but we're not looking at the links, the climate change links into most of these stories. We are talking about how farming is failing in some area. There is, some place is, fighting drought, and then as a result, people are moving. But these slow onset events like these frequent flooding, heat stress, and coastal erosion are not something that reports are connecting in detail. And also, public understanding of climate migration is very, very limited. So, as our fieldwork in many of these sites show, the locals do not have an understanding of why they are seeing so many migrants in their city. So for them, it is okay, there's something, there is no development in their own city, so they are then en masse migrating to another city, and they're always looked at as outsiders or people who don't belong there. And then that also creates a lot of negative perceptions and biases towards migrants in many, many cities. And sometimes the way migrants are reported about, this constantly victimizing them as people who are helpless, some narratives, even some of these human interest stories, the narratives are how, they had to leave everything and they lost everything and they moved here and they're suffering here. So it is these constant portrayal of sufferings and victimizing that we read, but I think we are then not looking at the agency that shapes these decisions, or agencies that migrants have to take a decision to leave a familiar place and move to another place to make their own life better. And also then not looking at the agency of people who decide to stay back, and like especially women who are unable to move due to many, many reasons, due to gender and household restrictions, cultural norms, etc., etc. Sometimes the owners of managing the household or childcare or even farming then falls on the women because the men in the family have migrated, or they might have elderly people to take care of. So I think even if you look at the club's website, there is a blog that talks about even the invisible life of migrant women in destination cities. We have one of our researchers has extensively documented about how labor of migrant women who move with men who do then work that are very visible to us in construction sites and other places, but women who then run the household, that work becomes invisible. So there are multiple aspects and layers to climate linked migration, and it is important that we tell these stories. And as Nihal said, media is very powerful, and it is one of the most impactful influencer in terms of bridging research and public discourse and policy discourse. It sort of acts as a medium to then change how we make lives better for the people. It becomes the voice of these people. So which is why we think that these stories are important and they have to be told in more frequency than it is now.
Thank you, Sophia. Yes, please.
Yeah, so responsible reporting. So I'm not going to delve into detail much. The Shifting Grounds storytelling guide is available on the CLAPS website as well as the IHS website, and it is open source. It's free to read, share, and download. All IHS publications are open source, and there's also a lot more work about climate change and migration that IHS has done, and also disaster and risk recovery projects that IHS has done over the many, many years. So it's all free to read. Please check them out whenever you have time. And so responsible reporting by that. So, and also I would like to clarify that when we did the Shifting Grounds and did the media analysis, our intention was not to criticize or critique journalism to say that we are doing a bad job. So we also understand the limitations and challenges that we have right now. So, but I think what we want is, when we say responsible journalism, then to probably just add a little bit more layer to it. Say, for example, sometimes when there is a flood, or when flood then sort of prompts or forces people to move from their place to somewhere else, and they're not able to return, there is extensive focus on that. Right, we talk about people moving in large numbers, and we put photos and take these quotes from a couple of migrant people, and or people affected by disasters, and then there is a quote from a government official or an NGO or organizations working there. But this also, we understand, like, all of this stems from this pressure to publish and get information to people and get the right information. But I think we also need to look at a little bit about who these people are, what their experiences have been, why they migrated, what is the problem in the source, and what is the problem in the destination. So currently the issues that we're looking at these as two different things. There are very, very few reports that look at migration as a full cycle. And one story that I would like to recall is Scrolls, a bus full of migrants, where they managed to um, trace that migrant or migrant workers' journey from Odisha to Kerala. So then you understand the risks that migrants actually take to go to a place and set up life in basically a strange land, adapt to the situations there. And as I said, migration does not then solve the vulnerabilities, it just shifts the location. So all of these issues that they have faced in their source destination, they are probably going to fight it, in the source is also what they're going to fight in their source destinations. For example, bad housing, access to basic services. So some of our field work in Kochi has shown that migrant workers live in really very bad housing, because Kochi is a very hot city. And when we look at heat stress, and when we interview a migrant worker, then we only try to look at this bodily distress, right? How heat is affecting the person. But what the stories sometimes miss is looking at living and working conditions, and labor codes, labor policies for migrant workers, and how social systems are set against them. In Kerala, at least, there is a 12 to 3 mandate that during summer, workers have to be given rest. Like, they have to take a break, especially in construction sites, that they cannot work between 12 and 3. But interviews with migrant workers in Kochi, we have found that this mandate mostly exists on paper. It may work on some union-led sites and some of these sites, but this is not something that is enforced in total. And so this is where then we have to question some of these policies and how they're working, and where enforcement is weak in terms of making these good policies work. And so then I think it is important to include more of migrant voices and lived experiences into the narrative, and avoid these stereotypes. So sometimes, unfortunately, media becomes the enabler of these stereotypes. Some research in Kerala has shown that migrant workers are victimized even through media. So when the 2018 floods happened, a lot of migrant workers were told to return back to their hometowns, and they were not part of any of these relief shelters. And there's been some reports that have also criticized this move by local administration and other relief organizations. So, so all of these biases, especially when there is one migrant worker that has been caught for doing something wrong, then it sort of labels everybody else as criminals, or the common narrative of calling them boys, and reducing them to certain labels in many like Bengalis, or calling them by some of these languages, like Tamil migrants in Kerala are called Pandis, and Bengali migrants and Odia migrants are called Bais. And some of these Malayalam language reporting itself has amplified this sort of language. So, and I think as reporters, we have the responsibility to then not stereotype, and also not continuously use only showcase suffering and victimhood and everything, but instead look at what their life is like, when they move from one place to another, how they are adapting to in the destination cities, what are the issues, and how policy and public discourse can change to include migrant workers in services, policies, in terms of housing policies, and climate policies and everything else. Right. So common.
Thank you, Sophia.
Yeah. Are we running out of
Do
time?
you want to take one? Yeah, we have 5 minutes from thing, but I would want you to continue unless there is a question that anybody wants to ask. Nihal and Sophia.
Okay, I see a couple of hands going up.
Okay, maybe yeah, Madhavi has a question.
Yes.
First,
Yeah. Can I go ahead?
yes, please go ahead,
Yes,
Madhavi.
please. Yeah. Thank you so much for that. Such an excellent presentation, actually, and your work. I found your point about how migrants are often portrayed in a very homogeneous way really striking. Actually, it made me to wonder when media doesn't really specify who is migrating, or leaves out experiences of women and other marginalized groups. So, what does that do to the larger understanding of climate migration in India? So, do you think that this kind of simplification ends up shaping policy and public perceptions in ways that overlook the very different and unequal realities people are dealing with? And how can journalism bring in more of these layered intersectional experiences without making the story too complex or difficult to communicate? And I have another thing that really stood out to me was a strong focus on floods and cyclones, especially in certain regions, while slower processes like a drought, heat stress, and long-term agrarian decline, we doesn't seem to get the same attention. So I'm curious to know, do you see this as a limitation of how news works, where it tend to focus on visible, immediate events? And if so, what would it take for journalism to better capture these slower, more cumulative processes that are actually driving a lot of migration over time? And how do we move from seeing migration as a one-time crisis to understanding it as something much more ongoing and structural? If you can.
Right. Thank you for these questions. Nihal, I can take the first one. Would you like to respond to the second question? Yeah. Okay. Madhvi, please correct me if I'm wrong. So your question was about how do journalists then not oversimplify migration, and then also include their experiences and voices in the coverage. Is that right?
Yes.
Right. So one way of looking at is, see, sometimes I would like to use COVID as an example here. So that was a very visible crisis where we actually saw migrants walk thousands of miles because they didn't have access to transport or food and any other services when the crisis struck and when the lockdown happened. And it also exposed the faults in the systems where, while the policies and the governance considered this lockdown, and while they were working to ensure safety of everybody from the pandemic, so one group of people that was left out were the migrants, until they started walking and the visual evidence started coming out. So only when that, so it was some sort of a watershed movement to realize, and it made the country realize how much of migrant workers live in any city, like across the country. So, and that visibility is then what prompted the government to quickly act and then, give them help and some sort of support. Although Kerala was really considerate on that front and made arrangements, but that was just one state among the many states that we have in the country. But only when that crisis was very, very visible to us and we cannot look away from it, some action happened. So the situation is similar here. We talk about migrants, we talk about the issues here, but we often tend not to focus on what prompted them to migrate. It could be, so one example is some of the migrant workers who work as, say, waste collectors in destination cities or construction workers are actually landowners and farm workers or farm owners in their source destinations. So it is a different kind of livelihood that they are doing in destination cities. And that's the full cycle that we are missing. So it could be because of crops failing for many, many years. It's not that they have tried to make things work in their source areas. It could be because there is no rainfall for a prolonged reason. And a lot of them also try to shift the cultivation patterns to adapt. But only when they exhaust all options, they make the decision to move. So this, I feel like then we have to make that full connection. So as I was saying, unless we connect, make these links between the source and destination, we are not going to get a fuller picture. And even when we are trying to cover issues in an area, like there are a lot of informal migrant settlements in Bangalore where we are currently based in. So we're not looking at housing issues in the settlement, even the typology of the housing, right? Like a lot of them live in these makeshift homes. So in that case, then what will help them? What can reporting change is to push for a policy change to include migrant workers in some of the housing policies. So I think the discourse is changing. So people and administration is also trying to include migrants in most of the policies. But I think there needs to be a constant advocacy from the media to include and look at it from the policy and legal perspective. So if housing can change, so what and how can labor codes change? So IHS has also done an extensive review of nearly 100 policies in 3 states that we are working to look at how if migrants are part of that work. So there is a report that we have published, which we can share as a resource. And you can see that out of the 94 policies and interventions that we have reviewed, including the one nation, one ration system, not every policy, or like very few, like maybe if my memory is right, about 5 or 6 policies is inclusive of migrants, right? So this is where reporting also must shift to then talk about challenges. So we are reporting about challenges in one nation, one ration, but we are not talking about how this is so exclusive of migrants because of documentation. The portability of the schemes are still challenges. So there are more barriers to the scheme than enablers. And I think, so maybe a shift in that kind of a lens is then helpful to make migration and migrant workers inclusive in our society and policy and everywhere else. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
I'd just like to add here that when I have reported on migrants, and one of the stories I did last, one of the migrant workers in Bangalore, she works as a domestic worker, has come from Yadgir district, has been living in Bangalore for 10 years, And when we live in a city for 10 years, we call ourselves people from that city. But when migrants even live after 10 years are called migrants. And when working class people live in a city even after 10 years, they are called migrants. So there was one interesting thing that she said. She said that हम लोग इंसानों में भी नहीं गिने जाते. Like we are not even counted as people sometimes. And she said that because despite living here, she does not have. I mean, at least she's from Karnataka, but she does not have voting rights, and that becomes where one of the what experts have repeatedly told me is that's why media matters here, because migrants don't have voting rights in the states or the cities that they live in, they are not people that the policymakers want to listen to, and that's where, and yet they build our cities. It becomes almost it feels like we have an important job to do to kind of make I'm not saying they are voiceless, they are not, but I'm just saying we need to be that bridge. Over to you, Nihal, to answer second part of Madhavi's questions. We may be going like 5 minutes overboard. I hope it's okay with people who are online. We'll try to end in another 5 minutes or so. Nihal.
Thanks, Mahima, and thanks, Madhavi, for the question. I'll try to get at it. In terms of I mean, my sense is the rapid onset events like cyclones, floods, and all are much more visible, making it much more easier to talk about. So if you go immediately in the aftermath of any disaster, and if you ask people why they're migrating, you can immediately have some sort of an association or attribution to that event, and then that becomes a form of climate related migration. But when we are talking, I mean, you have to really unpack migration which is related to climate change, which gets manifested in the form of slow coastal erosion or droughts and heat stress and so on. I think in a lot of cases, it is about asking the second order questions there, because even when we do much of our field work and data collection there, if we ask people why are they migrating, most often, particularly also with most often the first sort of responses, because there is no job or there's no livelihood opportunities or the wages are less here. And it is quite natural for us also to stop there and then try to understand that a little bit better. But if you do ask a lot more second order questions about why the crops have been failing for over several years, why the catch of fish has been going down over the past several years, then there are real climate or climate change or environmental change linkages that you can draw to some of these experiences which triggers movement. And I do understand how that might be fairly difficult. What like researchers like us, the advantage that we have is that we do get a much longer time frame to engage with places and people. So we have that the luxury of building that sort of rapport with people to have these very long conversations, which is, I do understand, is very tricky when it comes to in a journalistic case where you do have much more shorter deadlines and timelines to report on stories and so on. So I don't really have a fix to that, but I guess step one to work within the constraints that a journalistic profession results in is probably to ask a lot more of these second order questions, which kind of pushes people to think about the second order impacts of climate change there.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nihal. That's such an excellent insight. Is there, we are just one, I mean, I'd like to close at 1:10. If there is any quick question you'd like to ask, please. All right. In that case, I mean, Sophia had a couple of points to make, but I think we will just share the slides. She has a lot of resources on those slides as well. Thank you, Sophia and Nihal, for joining. It is really insightful. And I just wanted to say that, sorry about the crying baby in the background. Thanks for attending today's session.